Imagine being dunked into boiling water, pulled out, then dunked again, and again, until you're dead. This actually happened in London, 1531. A cook named Richard Roos was accused of poisoning his master's dinner. 2 people died. But here, as the twist King Henry VIII was so terrified of poison that he invented a brand new law just to make boiling legal. Roos became the first man in English history sentenced to this fate. Before I show you what happened at Smithfield that day, hit subscribe if you want more dark Tudor secrets they don't teach in school. February 18th, 1531. Lambeth Marsh, just south of the Thames. Bishop John Fisher's palace sat quiet in the winter cold. Inside, the kitchen buzzed with activity. Fisher was hosting guests for dinner, and his cook Richard Roos was preparing the evening meal. Roos had served in Fisher's household for years. He knew the routines. He knew the recipes. Tonight's main dish was simple, a thick porridge, the kind that warmed you from the inside on a freezing February night. The large pot bubbled over the fire. Roos stirred it carefully. This wasn't just food for the bishop. Fisher had invited members of his household staff and even opened his doors to the poor that evening. It was an act of charity, common for religious men of his position. The porridge was ladled into wooden bowls and carried into the hall. But Fisher himself didn't eat. Maybe he wasn't hungry. Maybe he sensed something was wrong. Historical records show he fasted that night. It saved his life. 17 other people did eat. Within an hour, the screaming started. Servants doubled over, clutching their stomachs. Guests vomited violently. The pain spread like wildfire through the household. People collapsed on the stone floors. Some couldn't stop convulsing. Among them was Bennet Kirwan, a gentleman in Fisher's service. He was young, trusted, part of the inner circle. The poison tore through him. His body couldn't fight it. Then there was Alice Trippitt, a poor widow who had come seeking alms. Fisher's charity had welcomed her to the table. Now she writhed in agony, her body betraying her with every breath. The household descended into chaos. Physicians were summoned, but this was 1531. They had no idea what they were dealing with. No antidote, no cure. Just desperate attempts to purge the poison from suffering bodies. Bennet Kirwan died first, then Alice Trippitt. 2 lives gone, 15 others barely clinging to survival. Panic rippled through the palace. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't bad meat or spoiled grain. Someone had deliberately poisoned the bishop's dinner. But who? Eyes turned to the kitchen, to Richard Roos. He had prepared the meal. He had access to the pot. And now people were dead. Roos knew what was coming. He'd seen the bodies. He'd heard the accusations. In Tudor England, being a suspect in a poisoning case meant one thing: torture, confession, execution. He ran. Bishop Fisher's household guards searched every room, every corridor. They found Roos trying to flee the palace grounds. He didn't get far. Fisher's own brother dragged him back, hands bound, face pale with terror. The cook who had served the bishop faithfully for years was now his prisoner. By morning, Richard Roos was locked in the Tower of London. The questions began immediately. What did you put in the porridge? Who told you to do this? Was this an attempt on the bishop's life? Roos's answers would shock everyone, but they wouldn't save him. The Tower of London had broken stronger men than Richard Roos. Cold stone walls, iron chains, and interrogators who knew exactly how to extract confessions. They wanted answers. Who ordered this? Was it an assassination plot? Who paid you? But what Roos told them was stranger than anyone expected. He claimed it was a jest, a joke gone horribly wrong. According to his confession, a stranger had approached him days before the dinner. This man gave Roos a white powder, telling him it was a harmless laxative, something to play a prank on the household. Make them rush to the privy, nothing more. Roos said he believed the stranger. He mixed the powder into the porridge. He thought it would be funny. 2 people were dead. 15 others nearly died. And his defense was that he thought it was a prank. Nobody believed him. The interrogators pressed harder. They likely used torture standard practice in the tower for suspected traitors. But Roos's story never changed. A stranger, a powder, a terrible mistake. If he was lying, he took the real truth to his grave. But there was a bigger question hovering over this case. Why target Bishop Fisher? Fisher wasn't just any bishop. He was one of the most powerful religious figures in England, and he had made a dangerous enemy King Henry VIII himself. Henry wanted to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon, so he could marry Anne Boleyn. The Pope refused. Henry needed support from English clergy to break from Rome and create his own church. Fisher stood in his way. The bishop publicly opposed the divorce. He defended Catherine. He called Henry's plan sinful. In a time when crossing the king meant death, Fisher didn't flinch. This made him a target. Rumors swirled through London. Was the poisoning an assassination attempt? Had someone close to Anne Boleyn's family tried to eliminate Fisher? The Boleyns had already warned Fisher to stay away from Parliament. They wanted him silenced. But the investigation cleared them. Officially, at least. So if it wasn't a political plot, what was it? An accident? A servant's cruel joke? Or was Roos simply a convenient scapegoat for a failed murder that went too high up the chain to expose? The truth was buried under layers of Tudor politics, fear, and lies. What was clear was this. Richard Roos, a cook who had served faithfully for years, now sat in a cell facing execution. Whether he was guilty or innocent didn't matter anymore. Henry VIII had already decided his fate. The king was terrified of poison. It was invisible, untraceable, and could strike anyone at any time. Even kings, especially kings. This case hit too close to home. Henry wanted to make an example. He wanted every potential poisoner in England to think twice. And he wanted the punishment to match the horror of the crime. Parliament was summoned. A new law was being written. One that would change English justice forever. Richard Roos would be its first victim. Henry VIII couldn't sleep. Poison haunted him. It wasn't a new fear, but the Fisher case made it real in a way nothing else had. This wasn't some foreign plot in a distant land. This happened in London, in a bishop's palace, at a dinner table. If it could happen to Fisher's household, it could happen to anyone, even a king. Tudor England had no defense against poison. You couldn't see it. You couldn't smell it. A trusted servant could slip it into your wine, your bread, your morning meal. By the time symptoms appeared, it was too late. Henry obsessed over every bite of food. Who prepared it? Who carried it? Who stood nearby when it was served? His kitchens became fortresses of suspicion. Tasters sampled his meals before they reached his lips. Guards watched the cooks. The cooks watched each other. But even that wasn't enough, because Richard Roos had been a trusted cook. He'd served Bishop Fisher for years without incident. Trust meant nothing if someone could be bought, threatened, or fooled into murder. The Fisher poisoning proved something terrifying. Anyone could be killed at any moment, and the killer might never face justice worthy of the crime. That was the problem. Under English law in 1531, poisoning was treated like any other murder. The penalty? Hanging. Quick, almost merciful compared to what victims endured. They died slowly, painfully, their insides burning as the poison destroyed them from within. Where was the justice in that? A poisoner got a rope around the neck, and it was over in minutes. Their victims suffered for hours, sometimes days. Henry saw the imbalance, and he saw the danger. If the punishment wasn't horrific enough, what would stop the next servant, the next cook, the next conspirator from trying the same thing? Fear was the only deterrent Tudor England had. The king made an unprecedented move. He personally addressed the House of Lords about the Fisher case. Monarchs didn't usually involve themselves in criminal proceedings at this level. But Henry wasn't treating this as a simple murder. He called it treason. Poisoning, he argued, was an attack on the natural order. It was cowardly. It was invisible warfare. Anyone who used poison was an enemy of the realm itself, not just their victim. The lords listened. They understood the implications. If Henry declared this treason, the punishment could be far worse than hanging. Traitors faced executions designed to inflict maximum suffering and public spectacle. But even treason had its standard methods: beheading for nobles, hanging, drawing, and quartering for commoners. These were established, familiar horrors. Henry wanted something different, something that had never been done before in England, something so uniquely terrible that the mere thought of it would stop anyone from ever poisoning again. He wanted the punishment to mirror the crime itself. If Roos poisoned food that people consumed, then Roos would be consumed by something equally deadly. Parliament began drafting the law, and Richard Roos, still locked in his cell, had no idea what was coming. Parliament moved with terrifying speed. Within weeks of the Fisher poisoning, a bill was drafted, debated, and passed into law. It became known as the Act for Poisoning, and it changed everything. The law declared that from this moment forward, any person who committed murder by poison would be guilty of high treason. Not murder, treason. The difference mattered enormously. Murderers could appeal. They could claim self-defense, accident, or insanity. They had legal protections, however thin. Traitors had none. And the penalty for this new crime? Death by boiling in water or lead. England had never executed anyone this way before. Other European countries had used boiling for counterfeiters and coin clippers, but never for poisoners. Henry was creating something entirely new on English soil. The law was specific and deliberate. The convicted would be placed in a cauldron of water. The water would be heated until boiling. Then the prisoner would be submerged. The method was designed not for efficiency, but for suffering. But passing the law wasn't enough. Henry needed a victim to demonstrate it. He needed Richard Roos. This created a legal problem. Roos had committed his crime before the law existed. Under normal circumstances, you couldn't punish someone for breaking a law that didn't exist when they acted. It violated basic principles of justice. Henry didn't care. Parliament passed a separate document called an Act of Attainder, specifically naming Richard Roos. Attainders were political weapons. They declared someone guilty without trial, without evidence being presented, without any chance of defense. One day, you're a person with rights. The next day, Parliament declares you guilty, and you're already dead in the eyes of the law. Roos was attainted. His guilt was now a legal fact, not a question to be proven. There would be no trial, no jury, no opportunity to challenge the evidence or cross-examine witnesses. The act applied retroactively to his case, even though the poisoning happened before the law existed. Justice bent backward to catch him. The date was set. April 5th, 1531. Less than 2 months after the poisoning itself. Roos sat in the tower, probably unaware of the machinery grinding around him. He didn't know Parliament had debated his fate. He didn't know a new law carried his name in its justification. He didn't know he would be the first. Word spread through London. Whispers in taverns and marketplaces. Have you heard? They're going to boil the cook. Boil him alive. At Smithfield. Public execution. Some people were horrified. Others curious. Many wanted to see if the rumors were true. Would the king really do this? Smithfield Market had hosted executions before. Earnings, mostly. Heretics tied to stakes, flames consuming them while crowds watched. Londoners were familiar with public death. But boiling? That was different. That was new. That was designed to be worse than anything they'd seen. Richard Roos had days left. The cauldron was being prepared. The fire was being built. And England was about to witness something it would never forget. April 5th, 1531. Dawn broke over Smithfield Market. The square sat just outside London's old city walls, a wide open space where cattle were traded and crowds gathered for public events. It had another purpose, too. For centuries, Smithfield had been the city's stage for executions. Heretics burned here. Their screams echoed off the surrounding buildings, while smoke rose into the London sky. The ground had soaked up so much blood and ash that some said it was cursed. Others said it was holy, sanctified by the martyrs who died there. Today, it would witness something entirely unprecedented. By mid-morning, the crowd had already swelled to hundreds, maybe thousands. News of the boiling had spread through every corner of London. People came from across the city, pushing through narrow streets to reach Smithfield. They wanted to see if the rumors were true. In the center of the square stood the apparatus, a massive iron cauldron, far larger than anything used in kitchens. It sat over a pit filled with stacked wood and kindling. The fire had been burning for hours, heating the water inside. Steam rose in thick clouds, visible from blocks away. Above the cauldron, a wooden gibbet structure rose like a gallows. But instead of a noose, it held chains and a pulley system. This wasn't designed for a quick drop and snap of the neck. This was built for control, for repetition, for prolonged suffering. Guards in Tudor liveries stood around the perimeter, keeping the crowd at bay. Merchants who normally set up stalls here had been pushed aside. This morning, Smithfield had only one purpose. The crowd was restless. Some pushed forward, trying to get closer. Others hung back, suddenly unsure if they wanted to witness this. Parents covered their children's eyes. Pregnant women felt queasy just from the anticipation. Londoners had seen death before. Public executions were common entertainment, grim but familiar. Hangings at Tyburn, beheadings on Tower Hill, burnings right here at Smithfield. Death was part of city life, but boiling was different. The whispers rippled through the crowd. How long would it take? Would he scream? Could anyone actually survive being pulled out and put back in? No one knew, because no one in England had ever seen this before. Then the procession arrived. Guards emerged from the direction of the tower, marching through the crowd. Between them walked Richard Roos, hands bound, wearing only a simple shift. His face was pale, his steps unsteady. He'd been given last rites that morning. A priest had heard his final confession. The crowd pressed forward, craning their necks to see the man who had poisoned Bishop Fisher's household. Some shouted curses. Others fell silent, confronted with the reality of what was about to happen. Roos was led to the cauldron. The water bubbled violently, steam hissing into the cold April air. The chains waited. London held its breath. What happened next would haunt the city for generations. The executioners worked with cold efficiency. They fastened the chains around Roos's body, securing him to the gibbet's pulley system. This wasn't a simple dunking. The apparatus was engineered specifically for this execution, designed to give the executioners complete control over every moment. The method was deliberate. Lower him into the boiling water. Let the heat do its work. Then pull him back up. Allow a brief moment of air, of false hope, then plunge him down again. Repeat until dead. Contemporary accounts describe it with chilling precision. The Greyfriars Chronicle, written by a monk who likely witnessed the event, recorded that Roos was locked in a chain and pulled up and down with a gibbet at divers times until he was dead. Divers times, multiple immersions. This wasn't designed to kill quickly. It was designed to maximize the duration of suffering while keeping the prisoner conscious enough to experience every moment. The science behind it was brutal. Boiling water causes immediate shock to the body. Skin begins to burn within seconds. But human beings are remarkably resilient. Death doesn't come instantly. The body fights to survive, even as it's being destroyed. By pulling Roos out repeatedly, the executioners ensured he wouldn't simply lose consciousness and drown. The brief moments in open air revived him just enough to feel everything when he went back under. The cauldron was large enough that he could be fully submerged. The gibbet allowed the executioners to control the depth and duration. They decided when he went down and when he came up. They held absolute power over every second of his death. Historical records don't specify exactly how long the execution lasted. Some accounts suggest it took over an hour. Others remain vague, noting only that it was prolonged and terrible to witness. What we know for certain is that it wasn't quick. The fire beneath the cauldron had to be maintained throughout. Guards stood ready with more wood, keeping the water at a constant boil. The temperature couldn't drop. That would defeat the purpose. This had to be boiling continuously for the entire duration. The pulley system creaked with each lift and descent. Metal chains scraped against metal. The sound carried across the square, mixing with other noises that would soon fill Smithfield. Everything about this execution was calculated. Henry and Parliament hadn't just ordered Roos's death. They'd engineered a specific method that would serve as the ultimate deterrent. Every detail was intentional, from the public setting to the repeated immersions to the choice of boiling water itself. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone watching. A cook who poisoned food would be cooked himself. The punishment mirrored the crime in the most literal, horrifying way possible. This was Tudor justice at its most theatrical and cruel. Not just punishment, but propaganda. Not just execution, but a message written in suffering for all of England to read. The executioners were ready. The crowd was watching. The water was boiling. Richard Roos's ordeal was about to begin. The first descent was the worst. When the chains lowered Richard Roos into the boiling water, the sound that erupted from him wasn't quite human. Historical accounts record that he roared mighty loud, not screamed, roared, a primal animal sound of pure agony that echoed across Smithfield and beyond. The crowd flinched. Some covered their ears. Others stood frozen, unable to process what they were witnessing. Then he was pulled back up, gasping, steam rising from his body. The brief moment of air must have been both relief and renewed horror, knowing it would happen again. And it did. Down into the water. Another roar. Up again. Down. Up. Down. Each cycle seemed to last an eternity for those watching. The crowd's reaction split dramatically. Some couldn't bear it and turned away, pushing through the mass of bodies to escape. Others remained transfixed, unable to look away from the spectacle. Pregnant women in the crowd began collapsing. The combination of what they witnessed and the sounds assaulting their ears became too much. Contemporary records note they were carried away half dead from the scene, overcome by the horror of it. Not everyone felt sympathy. Some in the crowd remained stone-faced, unmoved by Roos's suffering. These were Londoners who had lost family to plague, who had watched children starve, who knew life was brutal and short. To them, Roos was a poisoner who deserved every second of this. One witness later remarked he would have preferred to see the headsman at his work instead. Even in an age accustomed to public executions, this crossed a line that made people uncomfortable. A beheading was over in one stroke. This dragged on and on. The roaring continued. Each time Roos was lifted from the water, the crowd could hear him drawing desperate breaths, choking, coughing. Then back down he went, and the terrible sounds resumed. Merchants in nearby streets heard it. Families in their homes blocks away heard it. The sound carried across medieval London like a warning bell, announcing that something unprecedented was happening in Smithfield. Children who witnessed the execution would remember those sounds for the rest of their lives. Decades later, elderly Londoners could still recall exactly where they stood that April morning, what they heard, how it made them feel. The execution became a dividing line in the city. There were those who believed Roos deserved this fate for poisoning innocent people. They saw justice, harsh but necessary. They believed Henry had sent a powerful message to anyone who might consider poison as a weapon. Then there were those who questioned everything about this. They wondered if the punishment exceeded even the crime of murder. They whispered that no Christian kingdom should execute people this way, no matter what they'd done. But no one could stop it. The law had been passed. The king had ordered it. The executioners carried out their duty with mechanical precision. All anyone could do was watch, listen, and remember that they lived in an England where this was now possible. Eventually, the roaring stopped. Historical records don't tell us exactly when Richard Roos died. No one timed it. No one marked the precise moment his heart stopped beating. The executioners continued the process until they were certain he was gone. The signs of death would have been unmistakable. The bodies stopped struggling. The desperate gasps for air ceased. When they pulled him up one final time, there was only silence. The crowd, which had been a churning mass of noise and reaction, grew quieter. Some people finally turned away, their morbid curiosity satisfied. Others remained, watching as the executioners unchained the body from the gibbet. What happened to Richard Roos's remains after death remains unclear in historical records. Unlike noble executions, where bodies were sometimes returned to families or given proper burial, Roos's final resting place wasn't documented. His body likely received an unmarked grave, if it received one at all. Some executed criminals were simply disposed of without ceremony. The crowd began to disperse slowly, moving back through Smithfield toward their homes and businesses. They carried the morning's horror with them, spreading the story through every tavern, marketplace, and church in London. By evening, everyone in the city knew. The cook had been boiled. The king's new law was real. Henry VIII had made his point with brutal clarity. The message was impossible to miss. Poison was now the most dangerous crime you could commit in England. Not just illegal, but high treason. Not just punishable, but punishable in ways that defied human imagination. Would anyone dare try it again after witnessing what happened to Roos? That was precisely what Henry wanted people to ask themselves. Every servant who prepared royal meals, every cook in noble households, every apothecary who dealt in herbs and medicines, they all received the message loud and clear. The execution achieved Henry's goal. It created terror. It established precedent. It showed that the king's power extended beyond traditional punishment into realms of creative cruelty designed to match the crime. But it also revealed something darker about Tudor justice. Laws could be created retroactively. Guilt could be declared without trial. Punishment could be designed specifically to maximize suffering. The machinery of state power had no limits when the king felt threatened. Smithfield returned to its normal activities in the days that followed. Cattle were traded. Merchants set up stalls. Life continued, but the memory remained. The ground where the cauldron stood became a reference point, a landmark of horror that locals would point out to visitors for years afterward. That was where they boiled the poisoner. That's where the cook died. That's where Henry showed England what happens when you threaten the natural order. The act for poisoning was now law, enforced in the most public way possible. Richard Roos had become more than a man who committed a crime. He became an example, a warning, a story parents told children about what happens when you break the king's law. But one question lingered in the minds of those who watched him die. Had justice actually been served? Or had they witnessed something far darker? In all the horror of Richard Roos's execution, one question was never properly answered. Was he actually guilty? His confession haunted the case from the beginning. A stranger approached him with white powder. The stranger claimed it was a harmless laxative, a prank ingredient. Roos believed him and mixed it into the porridge. He thought people would just have upset stomachs and rush to the privy. A crude joke, nothing more. 2 people died. 15 others nearly followed. And his entire defense rested on claiming he'd been tricked. It sounds absurd. What cook would risk his position, his livelihood, even his life for a bathroom joke? But here's the unsettling part: his story never changed. Even under interrogation in the Tower, Even facing torture, even knowing he would die, Roos maintained the same account. The stranger, the powder, the terrible mistake. People who lie under torture usually break. They confess to whatever their interrogators want to hear, just to make the pain stop. They add details, change stories, implicate others. Roos didn't. His version remained consistent to the end. That consistency is either the mark of an innocent man telling the truth, or a guilty man committed to his lie even unto death. Consider the actual crime itself. If Roos intended to murder Bishop Fisher, why use such a sloppy method? He prepared food for 17 people that night. Fisher was hosting guests from his household staff and poor people seeking charity. There was no guarantee Fisher would even eat the porridge. And he didn't. Fisher fasted that night, escaping the poison entirely. A professional assassin, or even a committed amateur, would have found a way to target Fisher specifically. Poison his wine cup. Contaminate only his portion. Not dump powder into a communal pot where anyone might eat it and Fisher might avoid it completely. The randomness of the victims supports Roos's claim of accident. Bennett Kerwin was a gentleman in Fisher's service. Alice Trippitt was a poor widow seeking alms. What motive would Roos have to kill either of them? They weren't powerful. They weren't threats. They were simply unfortunate people who happened to eat that night. Then there's the substance itself. Historical records describe it as poisoned yeast, but offer no specifics about what compound was actually used. Tudor England had no forensic science. No way to analyze the powder. No means to determine if it was indeed a deadly poison or something less lethal that went catastrophically wrong. Medicinal herbs and toxic plants often look similar. A cook dealing with a stranger might not know the difference. Apothecaries sometimes made fatal mistakes with dosages. What if Roos genuinely believed he'd been given a harmless substance? The Tower's interrogators wanted a confession that fit a narrative. Assassination plot, political conspiracy. Someone powerful pulling strings. But all they got was a simple cook claiming ignorance and terrible judgment. Maybe that was the truth. Maybe Richard Roos was just unlucky. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong decision to trust a stranger. Or maybe he took the real story to his grave, cooked alive for a crime he didn't fully commit. If Richard Roos was innocent, or simply foolish, that raises an even darker possibility. Someone else wanted Bishop John Fisher dead. Fisher wasn't just any religious figure. He was Henry VIII's most vocal opponent in the entire English church. While other bishops stayed silent or bent to royal pressure, Fisher stood firm and refused to compromise. The issue was Henry's marriage. The king desperately wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn, but the Pope wouldn't grant an annulment. Henry needed England's clergy to support him, to legitimize breaking from Rome and creating his own church where he controlled marriage law. Fisher blocked that path at every turn. He publicly defended Catherine. He wrote treatises arguing the marriage was valid under church law. He appeared before church courts on Catherine's behalf. He made Henry look like a tyrant attempting to discard a faithful wife for his mistress. This made Fisher dangerous. Not militarily dangerous. He commanded no armies. But politically and morally dangerous. His reputation for piety and scholarship gave weight to his opposition. As long as Fisher lived and spoke against the divorce, Henry's plans faced serious obstacles. The Boleyn family understood this perfectly. Anne Boleyn's rise to power depended entirely on becoming queen. Her family's fortune rested on that marriage happening. Fisher was their enemy. Before the poisoning, the Boleyns had already warned Fisher to stay away from Parliament. The message was clear: stop opposing us or face consequences. Fisher ignored the warning. He continued his resistance. Then came the dinner, the poison, the deaths. And Fisher, who should have been the primary target, happened to be fasting that night. The timing seemed suspicious to many observers then and historians now. Was this a failed assassination attempt? Had someone hired Ruse or manipulated him into poisoning Fisher's household, hoping to eliminate the bishop? Henry VIII's investigation officially cleared the Boleyn family of involvement. But Henry had strong personal reasons to protect them. His entire future depended on marrying Anne, implicating her family in an assassination plot would destroy those plans. So if there was a conspiracy, it would have been buried. Ruse would have been the perfect scapegoat, a simple cook who could be blamed, executed, and forgotten while the real conspirators walked free. Yet this theory has problems too. If powerful people wanted Fisher dead, they had easier methods. Accidents happened all the time. Men fell from horses, caught fever, or simply disappeared. Poison in a communal pot, where Fisher might not even eat, seems amateurish for a serious political plot. Unless that was the point. Make it look like a servant's mistake rather than assassination. Create plausible deniability. If Fisher had died that night along with his guests, it could have been dismissed as tragic food contamination rather than murder. The investigation focused on Ruse, extracted his confession, and moved quickly to execution. Too quickly, perhaps. Almost as if someone wanted the case closed before uncomfortable questions could be asked. Was Richard Ruse a convenient scapegoat sacrificed to protect more powerful people? Or was the political conspiracy theory just Tudor paranoia, reading too much into a simple tragedy? The truth died with Ruse at Smithfield. Whether Ruse was guilty, innocent, or manipulated almost didn't matter to Henry VIII. The king had already decided what this case represented. It wasn't just about one poisoning in one bishop's household. It was about sending a message that would echo through every kitchen, every household, every corner of England. Henry reportedly said he would cook the cook. The phrase reveals something chilling about his mindset. This wasn't just justice. It was poetic punishment, theatrical revenge, political propaganda wrapped in execution. The symmetry appealed to him. A cook who poisoned food would be cooked himself. The punishment would mirror the crime so perfectly that no one could miss the symbolism. It was Tudor justice at its most literal and most cruel. But Henry's choice went deeper than symbolism. He understood power in ways most rulers didn't. Fear was a tool, and public execution was how you wielded it. The more horrific the death, the more effective the deterrent. Hanging was too common, too quick, too forgettable. People watched hangings and went about their day. Beheading carried prestige. It was reserved for nobles. Burning was associated with religious heresy. None of these fit what Henry wanted to accomplish. He needed something unprecedented, something that would be talked about for years, something that made every potential poisoner in England think twice before considering such a crime. Boiling achieved all of that and more. The method was also practical from Henry's perspective. Poison terrified him personally. His paranoia about being poisoned consumed him. Every meal was a potential threat. Every servant who approached his table could be a killer. By creating the most horrifying punishment imaginable specifically for poisoners, Henry protected himself. He made the price of attempting to poison anyone, especially the king, so unbearably high that only the most desperate or insane would risk it. The theatrical element mattered too. Henry had a flair for spectacle. His court was famous for elaborate pageants, tournaments, and displays of wealth. He understood how to capture public attention and use it to reinforce his authority. Ruse's execution became one of those displays. Smithfield turned into a stage where Henry demonstrated absolute power over life and death. The king could create new laws, apply them retroactively, and invent entirely new forms of execution. No one was safe from his reach if they crossed him. Contemporary sources note that Henry took personal interest in the case. He didn't just sign off on Ruse's execution. He involved himself in Parliament's deliberations. He wanted this law passed. He wanted this execution to happen exactly as it did. Some historians argue Henry's actions reveal a streak of sadism in his character. Others suggest it was purely calculated, irrational, if brutal, political strategy. The truth probably lies somewhere between. Henry was capable of genuine cruelty, but he was also shrewd enough to weaponize that cruelty for political ends. Richard Roos may have been guilty or innocent, but to Henry, he was always just one thing: an opportunity to demonstrate that challenging the king, threatening his security, or disrupting his realm would result in punishment worse than death itself. The choice of boiling carried messages that went far beyond punishing Richard Roos. Water was sacred in Tudor England. It was used for baptism, for washing away sign, for purification. Yet water could also carry disease, spread plague, become contaminated and deadly. The duality wasn't lost on those who witnessed the execution. By using boiling water as the method of death, Henry transformed something essential to life into an instrument of destruction. The symbolism resonated deeply with a society that understood how easily food and drink could become poisoned, how invisible threats lurked in everyday sustenance. Roos had allegedly contaminated porridge, a common meal, something ordinary people ate daily. His punishment involved being consumed by another common substance turned lethal. The parallel was deliberate and powerful. But there was another layer to this execution that revealed Tudor social hierarchy. Boiling was designated specifically for poisoners of low status: servants, cooks, common people who used poison against their social betters. If a noble committed murder, even by poison, they would receive the dignity of beheading: quick, private, almost merciful. Roos got boiling because he was a cook, a servant, someone from the lower classes who had violated the natural order. The punishment reinforced class boundaries as much as it deterred crime. Your status determined not just if you would be executed, but how much you would suffer during execution. This distinction wasn't accidental. Tudor society was built on rigid social hierarchies. Everyone had their place. Servants served, nobles ruled. Any disruption of that order threatened the entire system. Poison was seen as particularly vile because it was the weapon of the weak against the strong. It required no physical courage, no martial skill. A servant could poison a lord without ever facing him in open combat. It was cowardly, invisible, dishonorable. The boiling punishment addressed all of these anxieties. It was public, ensuring everyone witnessed the consequences. It was prolonged, making the condemned suffer proportionally to their crime. It was humiliating, stripping away any dignity in death. European courts watched England's new law with mixed reactions. Some saw it as brilliant deterrent. Others viewed it as excessive brutality that went beyond Christian mercy. Italian ambassadors wrote dispatches describing the execution in horrified detail. French nobles debated whether such a law could work in their own kingdoms. England had always been slightly apart from continental Europe, separated by the Channel and distinct in its legal traditions. The Boiling Act reinforced that separation. This was uniquely English, uniquely Tudor, uniquely Henry's creation. Back in London, the execution's impact rippled through society for months afterward. Nobles scrutinized their servants more carefully. Cooks became objects of suspicion. Anyone who prepared food for powerful households lived under increased surveillance. The law had achieved exactly what Henry intended. It created an atmosphere of fear around poison that would protect him and other elites from invisible threats. Whether Richard Roos deserved his fate became almost irrelevant compared to the larger purpose his death served. But England's experiment with boiling wasn't over. Richard Roos was the first victim of the Acta for poisoning. He wouldn't be the last. March 17, 1542. Smithfield Market again. 11 years had passed since Richard Roos's execution. England had changed in that time. Henry VIII had finally gotten his divorce. Catherine of Aragon was dead. Anne Boleyn had been queen, then accused of treason and beheaded. Henry was now on his fifth wife, Catherine Howard. Bishop John Fisher, the man whose poisoned dinner started everything, was also dead. Henry had him executed in 1535 for refusing to accept the king as head of the Church of England. Beheaded on Tower Hill, ironically spared the horror of being poisoned. The acta for poisoning remained on the books, largely forgotten. No one had been boiled alive since Ruse. The law had served its purpose as deterrent. Poisoning cases in England had dropped dramatically. People remembered what happened to the cook who contaminated Bishop Fisher's porridge. Then came Margaret Davy. Historical records offer frustratingly little about her. We know she was young, described in some accounts as a maiden or servant woman. We know she worked in multiple households. And we know she was accused of something far worse than what Richard Ruse allegedly did. Margaret Davy supposedly poisoned 3 separate households. The first victims were in her master's home. He died from the poisoning. Then she moved to Coleman Street, where she worked for a family named Darrington. Both Mr. Darrington and his wife died. Finally, she was accused of poisoning a woman identified as Tinley's wife, who also succumbed. If the accusations were true, Margaret Davy was a serial poisoner. 3 different households. At least 4 confirmed deaths, possibly more. The scale of her alleged crimes dwarfed what Ruse had been accused of. But here's what's strange. While we have detailed contemporary accounts of Ruse's case, the dinner, the investigation, the Tower interrogation, witness testimony, Margaret Davy's story is brutally short in historical records. Charles Wriothesley, a Tudor chronicler who documented events of the period, mentioned her execution in his chronicle. His entry is brief, almost casual. Woman boiled at Smithfield for poisoning. Date recorded. Few other details. Why the difference? Ruse's case created a new law and shocked the nation. Margaret's case was precedent already established. By 1542, boiling for poisoners was legal and known. Her execution didn't generate the same level of public interest or detailed record-keeping. We don't know if she confessed. We don't know if she claimed innocence or accident like Ruse did. We don't know if there was a trial or an act of attainder. We don't know her age, her background, or her motive. What we do know is that on March 17, 1542, she was brought to Smithfield. The same square, the same cauldron, the same method that had killed Richard Ruse over a decade earlier. Another crowd gathered. Another fire was lit. Another person was chained and lowered into boiling water. The law Henry created in rage and fear claimed its second confirmed victim. But unlike Ruse's case, which raised questions about guilt and conspiracy, Margaret Davy's story raises different, darker possibilities about who she really was. Who was Margaret Davy? The question haunts historians because the evidence is so thin. We have her name, or names some records call her Margaret Davies, others Margaret Davy. Even her identity's uncertain. What we know suggests a pattern that's either chilling or tragic, depending on what you believe happened. She worked as a servant, moving between households. This was common for young women in Tudor England. Domestic service provided income, lodging, and sometimes a path to marriage. Servants often moved from one employer to another, seeking better wages or escaping difficult situations. But everywhere Margaret Davy worked, people died. Her first master fell ill and died after she prepared his food. Then the Darrington household in Coleman Street, both husband and wife, succumbed. Mysterious illness after she joined their service. Then Tinley's wife. 3 separate locations. Multiple deaths. All connected to one young woman who handled food preparation. If the accusations were accurate, Margaret Davy was something unprecedented in Tudor England, a female serial poisoner who methodically killed her employers. But there's another possibility that historians debate. What if she wasn't a murderer at all? Women in Tudor England, especially servants and lower-class women, often possessed extensive knowledge of herbs and medicines. They made remedies for common ailments, prepared poultices for wounds, mixed tonics for illness. This knowledge passed from mother to daughter outside formal medical training. The line between medicine and poison was dangerously thin. Many healing herbs could become toxic in the wrong dosage or combination. Foxglove could strengthen a weak heart or stop it completely. Hemlock in tiny amounts treated pain, but in larger doses killed. Even common kitchen herbs like nutmeg could be poisonous if consumed in excess. Did Margaret Davy understand this distinction? Or was she a well-meaning servant who tried to help sick employers with herbal remedies she did and fully understand? Tudor society was deeply suspicious of women who knew too much about herbs and potions. That knowledge often led to accusations of witchcraft. A woman who could heal could also harm. A servant with medical knowledge could easily be accused of murder when patients died, even if she was trying to help. The timing of her case matters too. By 1542, England was in the grip of religious turmoil. Henry had broken from Rome, dissolved the monasteries, and created an atmosphere of suspicion and accusation. People informed on neighbors. Servants were accused by employers. Anyone could be denounced for the slightest reason. What if someone wanted Margaret Davy gone? A jealous rival servant, an angry family member of a deceased employer, someone who stood to inherit property once certain people died? Blaming her for the deaths would be easy, especially if she'd been present when people fell ill. The Tudor legal system didn't require the same burden of proof modern courts demand. Circumstantial evidence and testimony from accusers were often enough. Margaret Davy likely faced an act of attainder like Roos did declared guilty by Parliament without trial, without the ability to present a defense. Was she a cold-blooded killer who murdered multiple people? Or an innocent woman caught in circumstances she couldn't explain, killed for knowledge that was seen as threatening? We'll never know. The records are too sparse, the evidence too corrupted by time. Margaret Davy's execution at Smithfield lacked the shock value of Richard Roos's death. By 1542, Londoners knew what boiling looked like. The cauldron wasn't new anymore. The method wasn't unprecedented. What had once been a horrifying spectacle designed to terrify all of England had become disturbingly, almost routine. The crowd that gathered was smaller than the one that witnessed Roos. Some came out of morbid curiosity, especially younger people who hadn't been alive in 1531. Others came because public executions were still free, entertainment in Tudor London, regardless of the method. But the atmosphere was different. Where Roos's execution had shocked even hardened observers, Margaret Davy's death seems to have generated less emotional response. The chroniclers who documented it wrote brief, factual entries. Woman boiled for poisoning. Date recorded. Move on to the next event. Perhaps London had grown desensitized. Perhaps the horror of the first execution couldn't be replicated. Or perhaps something was shifting in English attitudes toward this particular form of punishment. Margaret Davy holds a grim distinction in English history. She was the last person ever boiled alive under English law. After her execution in March 1542, the practice ended completely. No one else would ever suffer this fate on English soil. Why did it stop with her? The historical record doesn't give us a clear answer, but the timing suggests possibilities. Henry VIII was aging, increasingly ill, and distracted by his turbulent personal life. His fifth wife, Catherine Howard, would be executed for adultery just 2 months after Margaret Davy died. Henry's attention was elsewhere. More importantly, the law had already accomplished what it was designed to do. Poisoning cases had dropped dramatically. The fear had been instilled. Servants, cooks, and anyone who handled food understood the consequences. The deterrent worked. Continuing to boil people alive served no additional purpose. It had become excessive even by Tudor standards, which tolerated burning heretics and drawing and quartering traitors. There's a level of cruelty that even brutal societies eventually recognize as counterproductive. Some contemporary observers began questioning whether boiling aligned with Christian mercy. England was still wrestling with religious identity after the break from Rome. Questions of sin, Punishment and redemption were constantly debated. Could a Christian kingdom justify such suffering, even for criminals? The practical concerns mattered too. Executions were expensive to stage. Boiling required specific equipment, massive amounts of fuel to heat the water, and skilled executioners. Hanging was cheaper and faster. For a government dealing with political upheaval and potential religious war, efficiency mattered. Margaret Davy's execution marked an ending, though no one realized it at the time. The cauldron was dismantled. The chains were removed. Smithfield returned to other forms of execution, burning for heretics, hanging for common criminals. The acta for poisoning remained law, but without its signature punishment, it had lost its teeth. Poisoning was still high treason, but the specific horror that Henry had created was fading into history. Within 5 years, both the law and the practice would be officially abolished. But for now, in March 1542, Margaret Davy became the final victim of England's darkest and most theatrical form of justice. Her death closed a chapter. What came next would determine whether that chapter was remembered as justice or as England's shame. January 28, 1547, Henry VIII died at age 55. His son Edward VI inherited the throne at just 9 years old. A child king meant the realm was governed by regents and advisors, men who looked at Henry's laws with fresh eyes. One of their first acts was reviewing the kingdom's legal code. England had accumulated decades of legislation, under Henry some brilliant, some brutal, much of it controversial. The advisors had to decide what to keep and what to abolish. The acta for poisoning came under immediate scrutiny. It had been 16 years since Richard Roos died. Only 2 confirmed executions had occurred under the law. Some historians suggest there may have been others in provincial towns, records lost or never properly kept. But in London, the official count remained 2. Edward's government repealed the Boiling Act that same year. The reasoning was practical and moral. Poisoning would still be treated as murder, punishable by hanging. But the specific provision for boiling was removed from English law forever. The experiment had ended. Parliament's decision reflected a shift in English attitudes. Even in an age that accepted public execution as normal, boiling had proven too extreme. It crossed lines that even Tudor sensibilities recognized as excessive. The law had accomplished Henry's goal of deterring poisoners. But at what cost? 2 people, possibly more, had suffered deaths so prolonged and agonizing that witnesses were traumatized. Pregnant women had collapsed from the horror. Hardened Londoners had turned away, unable to watch. Looking back now, nearly 500 years later, the Boiling Act reveals something profound about power and fear in Tudor England. Henry VIII used Richard Roos's execution to send a message that reverberated through an entire kingdom. He showed that royal power could invent new forms of punishment, apply laws retroactively, and strip away traditional legal protections when the king felt threatened. But it also revealed limitations. Even absolute monarchy had boundaries. Even in Tudor England, there were levels of cruelty that society would eventually reject. The law lasted only 16 years, a brief experiment in theatrical punishment that England ultimately abandoned. Smithfield Market still exists in London today. It's a historic neighborhood, home to restaurants and markets, tourists and locals. Very few people walking those streets know that this was where Richard Roos and Margaret Davy were boiled alive. No memorial marks the spot. No plaque commemorates their deaths. History has largely forgotten them, remembered only in obscure chronicles and academic papers. But their legacy lives on in a strange way. They represent a moment when England confronted the darkest possibilities of justice, when punishment became performance, when deterrence required torture, when the machinery of state power created suffering specifically designed to terrify an entire nation. Richard Roos may have been guilty or innocent. Margaret Davy may have been a serial killer or a victim of circumstance. We'll never know for certain. What we know is this: They were the first and last victims of a law so cruel that even Tudor England couldn't stomach it for long. Their deaths closed a dark chapter. England moved on. But the questions they raise about justice, power, and the limits of punishment remain as relevant today as they were in 1531.